The ivory lace of her wedding dress had turned gray with dust by the time Rose Garrett stumbled into the saloon, her veil trailing behind her like a ghost, and every head turned to witness a bride without a groom. She stood in the doorway of the Lucky Star Saloon in Hachita, New Mexico, her chest heaving with exhaustion and humiliation. The afternoon sun of September 1883 cast long shadows across the wooden floorboards, and the piano player's fingers froze mid-chord. Rose's auburn hair had fallen loose from its carefully pinned arrangement, cascading over her shoulders in wild waves. Her green eyes, red-rimmed from crying, swept across the room full of stunned faces. She had walked 3 miles from the church in her satin slippers, and her feet were bleeding. "Water," she managed to whisper, her voice cracking. "Please." A tall man rose from a corner table, his chair scraping against the floor. He wore dusty leather chaps over dark denim, a burgundy shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and a black hat that shadowed his face. His spurs jingled softly as he crossed the room with long, purposeful strides. When he reached her, Rose could finally see his face clearly. He had strong, angular features, a jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble, and eyes the color of honey that held both concern and something else she could not quite name. "Madam," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her exhausted body. He took her elbow gently, steadying her when she swayed. "Let me help you." Rose wanted to protest, wanted to maintain some shred of dignity, but her legs were giving out. The cowboy caught her before she hit the floor, lifting her into his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing. The saloon erupted in murmurs, but he ignored them all, carrying her to a table near the back. He set her down carefully in a chair and pulled another close, sitting so their knees almost touched. "Charlie," he called to the bartender without taking his eyes off Rose, "water and some whiskey, and send someone for Doc Patterson." "I do not need a doctor," Rose protested weakly, but her hands were shaking as they gripped the edge of the table. "Your feet are bleeding through your shoes, and you look like you have been through a dust storm." His tone was gentle but firm. "You need tending to." Charlie brought the water first, and the cowboy held the glass to Rose's lips. When her hands proved too unsteady, she drank gratefully, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. When she had finished, he set the glass down and studied her face with an intensity that made her skin warm despite everything. "I am Yates Quinn," he said, "and you are about to tell me the name of the man I need to hunt down." Rose let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Why would you do that? You do not even know me." "Any man who leaves a woman at the altar deserves a reckoning." Yates's jaw tightened, and Rose saw his hands curl into fists on his thighs, especially one who would leave you. The way he said it, with such conviction, and something that sounded almost like reverence, made fresh tears spring to Rose's eyes. She had spent the entire walk from the church trying not to cry anymore, but this stranger's kindness broke through her fragile composure. "Thomas Pemberton," she said, the name bitter on her tongue. "He left a note with the Reverend, said he could not go through with it, said he realized he loved another woman, someone from his past who had come back to town last week." Yates's expression darkened. "Pemberton, the banker's son?" Rose nodded miserably. "We had been engaged for 8 months. Everything was planned. My dress cost more than my father makes in 3 months at the feed store. All our family and friends were there, and he just left me standing there like a fool." "You are no fool," Yates said with such certainty that Rose looked up at him in surprise. "He is the fool. Any man who would give you up is the biggest damn fool in the New Mexico territory." Before Rose could respond, Doc Patterson arrived, a kindly man in his 60s with wire-rimmed spectacles. He knelt beside Rose's chair and carefully removed her ruined slippers, clicking his tongue at the state of her feet. As he cleaned and bandaged the blisters and cuts, Yates disappeared and returned with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "For the pain," he explained, pouring a generous amount into one glass and sliding it toward her. Rose had never been much of a drinker, but she accepted the glass and took a careful sip. The liquid burned going down, but it spread warmth through her chest, and took the edge off the pain in her feet and her heart. "You got somewhere to go?" Yates asked after Doc Patterson had finished and left with instructions to stay off her feet for a few days. "Family?" "I cannot go home," Rose said quickly, panic rising in her throat. "Everyone will be there, all the wedding guests offering their pity. I cannot face them. Not yet." Yates was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the table. Then he nodded, seeming to come to a decision. "I have a room at the boarding house down the street. Mrs. Chen, who runs it, is respectable and has an extra room available. You can stay there tonight, and we will figure out the rest tomorrow." "I cannot accept that," Rose protested, even as exhaustion threatened to pull her under. "You have already done too much." "You can, and you will." Yates stood and offered his hand. "Come on, let me help you there. Those bandages will not hold if you try to walk on your own." Rose stared at his outstretched hand, calloused and strong, and something in her chest shifted. This stranger had shown her more care in the past hour than Thomas had in recent months. She placed her hand in his and let him help her to her feet. When she tried to take a step, pain shot through her soles, and she gasped. Without hesitation, Yates swept her back into his arms. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "Sure you can," he agreed, with a hint of a smile. "But you do not have to." He carried her out of the saloon and down the dusty street of Hachita. The town was small, barely more than a collection of buildings clustered along the Southern Pacific Railroad line. Most of the residents made their living from the railroad, ranching, or the nearby silver mines. The sun was beginning to set, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple. Rose rested her head against Yates's shoulder, too tired to care about propriety anymore. Mrs. Chen's boarding house was a tidy 2-story building with a wraparound porch. The proprietor herself was a Chinese woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She took one look at Rose in her wedding dress and Yates carrying her, and her expression softened. "Second room on the left upstairs, Jim," she said without asking questions. "I will bring tea and something to eat." Yates climbed the stairs carefully and nudged open the door to a small but clean room. He set Rose down on the bed, which was covered in a faded quilt, and she immediately wanted to sink into it and sleep for a week. But first, she needed to get out of this dress. "I cannot reach the buttons," she admitted, her voice small. The wedding dress had seemed so beautiful that morning with its dozens of tiny pearl buttons running down the back. Now it felt like a prison. Yates hesitated, then moved behind her. His fingers were surprisingly gentle as he worked the buttons free one by one. Rose closed her eyes, focusing on breathing steadily. This should have been Thomas's job, on their wedding night, in the home they were supposed to share. Instead, a stranger was helping her out of a dress that represented nothing but broken promises. "There," Yates said when he had finished. He moved back toward the door quickly, as if aware of the intimacy of the moment. "Mrs. Chen will have something you can sleep in. I will be in the room at the end of the hall if you need anything." "Yates," Rose called as he reached for the door handle. He turned, his honey-colored eyes meeting hers. "Thank you for everything. You did not have to help me." Something flickered across his face, an emotion she could not quite read. "Yes, I did," he said simply. "Get some rest, Rose." He closed the door softly behind him, and Rose was left alone with her thoughts and her ruined dress. She carefully stepped out of it, leaving it pooled on the floor like a ghost of what should have been. Mrs. Chen arrived moments later with a simple cotton nightgown, a tray of tea and bread, and asked no questions. Rose ate mechanically, her mind replaying the day's events in an endless loop. She had woken that morning excited and nervous, her mother and sisters fussing over her hair and dress. She had felt beautiful for the first time in her life. Thomas was not the most romantic man, but he was stable and respectable, and Rose had convinced herself that was enough. Her father had warned her that Thomas seemed distracted lately, but Rose had dismissed his concerns. She should have listened. Now, lying in a strange bed in a borrowed nightgown, Rose felt the full weight of her humiliation crash over her. She buried her face in the pillow to muffle her sobs, not wanting Mrs. Chen or Yates to hear. She cried for the future she had imagined, for the children she had dreamed of having, for the home she would never make with Thomas. But mostly, she cried for herself, for being foolish enough to believe someone could truly love her. Sleep came eventually, fitful and filled with dreams of walking down an endless aisle toward an altar that kept receding further away. Rose woke to sunlight streaming through the thin curtains and the sound of voices downstairs. For a blissful moment, she forgot where she was and why. Then memory crashed back, and she groaned, pulling the quilt over her head. Her feet throbbed with each heartbeat, and her eyes felt swollen from crying. A knock on the door made her sit up. "Come in," she called, her voice hoarse. Mrs. Chen entered carrying a dress draped over her arm. "This belonged to my daughter," she said. "She moved to San Francisco last year. You are about the same size." The dress was simple calico in a blue that reminded Rose of the sky before a storm. "I cannot pay you," she admitted, shame heating her cheeks. "I left with nothing." "We will figure it out," Mrs. Chen said with a wave of her hand. "Mr. Quinn paid for your room for the week. He's downstairs having breakfast, if you feel up to joining him." Rose's heart did a strange little skip at the mention of Yates. She should not feel this way about a man she had just met, especially not the day after her failed wedding. But there was something about him that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt in a long time. She dressed carefully, wincing as she put weight on her bandaged feet. The dress fit reasonably well, though it was a bit loose in the waist. Rose braided her hair simply and pinched her cheeks to bring some color back to her pale face. When she looked in the small mirror hanging above the washstand, she barely recognized herself. The hopeful bride from yesterday was gone, replaced by someone who looked older and sadder. Downstairs, the dining room smelled of coffee and bacon. Yates sat at a table by the window, his hat hanging on the chair beside him. He looked up when Rose entered, and his face broke into a smile that transformed his serious features. He stood immediately, pulling out a chair for her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, as she sat down slowly. "Like I walked 3 miles in wedding slippers," Rose attempted to joke, but it came out flat. "But alive, thanks to you." "Mrs." Chen brought coffee and a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits without being asked. Rose realized she was starving and ate gratefully, while Yates watched her with an expression she could not decipher. "I have been thinking," he said when she had taken the edge off her hunger, "about what you're going to do now." Rose set down her fork, her appetite vanishing. "I suppose I will have to go home eventually, face everyone, try to put my life back together, whatever that means now." "Or," Yates said slowly, "you could come work for me." Rose stared at him. "What?" "I have a ranch about 10 miles outside of town. Small operation, but it is mine. Bought it last year after saving up for most of my life. I have been needing someone to help with the house, cooking for the hands, keeping the books. The work is hard, but honest, and you would have a place to stay away from town gossip." "You cannot be serious," Rose said, her heart pounding. "You do not know anything about me. I could be terrible at all those things." "Can you cook?" he asked. "Yes, my mother made sure I learned." "Can you read and write and do figures?" "I was the best student in my class," Rose said with a touch of pride. "Then you are qualified." Yates leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Look, I know this is sudden, but you need a place to go and I need help. It is a practical arrangement. You would have your own room in the main house, respectable wages, and time to figure out what you want your life to look like now." Rose's mind raced. The thought of going back to her parents' house, of facing the pitying looks and whispered gossip made her stomach turn, but going to live at a ranch with a man she barely knew seemed equally insane. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Really, you do not owe me anything." Yates was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the table. "My mother was left by my father when I was 10, he finally said. He just up and decided he wanted a different life and walked away. I watched her struggle for years, watched how people treated her, the judgment and gossip. She died when I was 17, worn down by hard work and a broken heart. He looked up at Rose, and she saw old pain in his eyes. I swore then that if I ever had the means to help a woman in a similar situation, I would. So that is what I am doing. Rose felt tears prick her eyes at his honesty. I am sorry about your mother. Me too. Yates cleared his throat and sat back. You do not have to decide right now. Take a day or two, think about it, but the offer stands. I do not need a day, Rose heard herself say. I will do it. I will come work for you. The smile that spread across Yates's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. Yeah? Yeah, Rose confirmed. And despite everything, she felt a small spark of hope kindle in her chest. Maybe this disaster could be the start of something new. Maybe being left at the altar was not the end of her story, but the beginning of a different one entirely. They spent the rest of the day preparing for Rose's move to the ranch. Yates went to retrieve his horse from the livery and arrange for a wagon, while Rose stayed at the boarding house, trying not to think about what people in town were saying. Mrs. Chen brought her a bundle of clothes that had belonged to her daughter, refusing to accept payment. You will need practical things for ranch work, she said firmly. No more fancy dresses. Rose accepted gratefully, touched by the woman's kindness. She had packed away her wedding dress in a trunk, unable to look at it, but not quite ready to destroy it either. Maybe someday she would burn it, but not yet. When Yates returned with a wagon in the late afternoon, Rose climbed up onto the seat beside him, her meager belongings stored in the back. As they left Hachita behind, heading west into the open desert, Rose felt something loosen in her chest. The landscape stretched out before them in shades of brown and gold, dotted with scrub brush and cacti. Mountains rose in the distance, purple against the darkening sky. It is beautiful, she said softly. It grows on you, Yates agreed. When I first came out here from Missouri, I thought it was the most desolate place on earth, but there is something about this land that gets into your blood. The way the light hits the mountains at sunset, the silence that is not really silence if you listen close enough. It feels like freedom. Rose understood what he meant. Despite the pain in her feet and her heart, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, she felt freer than she had in months. She had been so focused on becoming Thomas's wife, on fitting into the mold of what she thought she should be, that she had lost track of who she actually was. Tell me about your ranch, she said, wanting to know more about this man who had appeared in her life like something out of a story. Yates's face lit up as he talked. He had 200 acres of rough land, a decent water source from a spring-fed creek, and about 50 head of cattle. He had 3 hands who helped with the work. An older man named Pete, who had been a cowboy all his life, and 2 younger men, brothers named Jack and Sam. They were good workers, Yates explained, but they needed someone to cook proper meals and keep the place from falling into complete disorder. I have been doing the cooking, he admitted with a rueful grin. And let us just say the men have been very understanding about my lack of skills in that area. Rose found herself smiling, really smiling, for the first time since she had walked into that church. How bad are we talking? I once burned beans so badly that we had to throw out the pot. Rose laughed, and the sound surprised her. She had not thought she would be capable of laughter today, but something about Yates made it easier to breathe, easier to imagine that life might continue after all. The ranch appeared as they crested a low rise, and Rose caught her breath. It was not grand, but it was solid and real. A wooden house with a porch, a barn, a corral where horses moved like shadows in the gathering dusk. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney, and she could see the orange glow of lamplight in the windows. Home, Yates said simply, and Rose heard the pride in his voice. He helped her down from the wagon, his hands spanning her waist, and for a moment they stood close enough that Rose could smell leather and sage and something that was uniquely him. Her breath caught, and she stepped back quickly, confused by her own reaction. The ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse as Yates began unloading Rose's things. Pete was exactly as she had imagined, weathered and bow-legged with a gray mustache. Jack and Sam were in their early 20s, tall and lanky with matching grins. All three men stopped short when they saw Rose, their eyes widening. "Boys, this is Rose Garrett," Yates said. "She is going to be helping out around here, cooking and keeping house. I expect you all to be on your best behavior and treat her with respect." "Yes, sir," they chorused, removing their hats. Pete stepped forward, his shrewd eyes taking in Rose's bandaged feet and borrowed clothes. "Pleased to meet you, madam. We have been needing a woman's touch around here for some time." "I will do my best," Rose said, lifting her chin. She might be heartbroken and displaced, but she was not going to let that define her. Yates showed her into the house, carrying her trunk. The main room served as both kitchen and living area with a stone fireplace, a long wooden table, and shelves lined with supplies. 2 doors led off the main room. Yates opened one to reveal a small bedroom with a real bed frame, a dresser, and a window that looked toward the mountains. "This was going to be for whenever I got married," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "But I have been sleeping in the other room just fine. You will have privacy here." "Yates, I cannot take your room," Rose protested. "You can and you will," he said firmly, echoing his words from the day before. "Consider it part of your wages." He left her to settle in, and Rose sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden turn her life had taken. Just yesterday morning she had been preparing to marry Thomas Pemberton, to become a banker's wife living in town. Now she was at a ranch 10 miles from anywhere, working for a cowboy she barely knew. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a strange sense of rightness, as if this was where she was meant to be all along. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging the dresses Mrs. Chen had given her in the small wardrobe. At the bottom of her trunk, she found something that made her heart clench, the journal Thomas had given her as an engagement gift. She had written in it faithfully for months, chronicling her hopes and dreams for their future together. Now those pages felt like lies. Rose opened the journal to the first blank page and picked up a pencil. "September 15th, 1883, she wrote. "Today I begin a new life." The next few days fell into a rhythm that surprised Rose with its ease. She woke before dawn to start breakfast for the men, learning to cook on the wood stove and adjusting recipes to feed hungry ranch hands. Pete turned out to be a wealth of information, teaching her tricks for stretching supplies and dealing with the challenges of cooking in ranch conditions. Jack and Sam were endlessly cheerful, always ready with a joke or story, and they treated Rose like a combination of sister and mother. But it was Yates who occupied most of her thoughts. He worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, tending cattle, training horses. Rose found herself watching him from the kitchen window, admiring the easy way he moved, the competence in everything he did. He was kind to his animals and patient with his men, but there was a core of steel in him that showed when something needed doing. In the evenings, after the hands had retreated to the bunkhouse, Yates would sit at the table while Rose cleaned up from supper. At first they worked in companionable silence, but gradually they began to talk. He told her stories about learning to be a rancher, about the mistakes he had made and the lessons he had learned. She told him about growing up in Hachita, about her father's feed store and her younger sisters and her dream of seeing the ocean someday. "Why the ocean?" Yates asked one night, genuinely curious. "I read about it in a book once," Rose explained, her hands stilling in the dishwater. "How it goes on forever, how it changes color with the light, how it sounds like the world breathing. I wanted to know if that was true or just pretty words." "We could go," Yates said, and Rose turned to look at him in surprise. "Someday, I mean. The railroad goes all the way to California. We could take a trip, see the ocean." The casual way he included himself in her dreams made Rose's heart skip. "That would be something," she said softly. A week after Rose arrived at the ranch, Yates had to ride into town for supplies. Rose volunteered to go with him, knowing she could not hide forever. She needed to face what had happened, needed to hold her head high despite the gossip. The ride into Hachita was quiet, both of them lost in thought. As they approached the town, Rose felt her anxiety spike. She smoothed down her borrowed dress and tried to calm her racing heart. "You do not have to do this," Yates said, glancing at her. "I can handle the supplies alone." "No," Rose said firmly. "I will not let Thomas Pemberton turn me into a coward." Yates's expression softened with something that looked like admiration. "That is my girl." The casual endearment made Rose's cheeks warm, but she did not correct him. They pulled up in front of the general store, and Rose could see curtains twitching in nearby windows. News of her arrival would spread through town within the hour. Inside the store, Mrs. Fletcher stood behind the counter, her eyes widening when she saw Rose. "Rose Garrett, as I live and breathe, we were all so worried about you after the wedding did not happen." "I'm fine, Mrs. Fletcher," Rose said, keeping her voice steady. "Just needed some time away from town." "I heard you have been staying at the Quinn Ranch," Mrs. Fletcher said, her tone making it clear what she thought of that arrangement. "People are talking, dear. A young unmarried woman living with a bachelor rancher. It is not proper." Rose felt anger flare hot in her chest. "What is not proper is a man leaving his bride at the altar," she said sharply. "Everything else is just survival." Yates stepped up beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Miss Garrett is my employee, nothing more," he said in a tone that brooked no argument. "She keeps house and cooks in exchange for wages and room. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." Mrs. Fletcher had the grace to look embarrassed. "Of course, Mr. Quinn, I meant no offense." They gathered their supplies quickly, and Rose kept her spine straight even as she felt the weight of stares and whispers. As they were loading the wagon, a familiar voice called out, "Rose, wait!" She turned to see Thomas Pemberton hurrying toward her, his face anguished. He looked terrible, with dark circles under his eyes and his usually neat hair disheveled. Behind him, a pretty blonde woman watched from the doorway of the bank. "Please, Rose, I need to talk to you," Thomas said, reaching for her arm. Yates stepped between them smoothly, his hand resting on his gun belt in what might have been a casual gesture but carried an unmistakable warning. "The lady does not want to talk to you." "This does not concern you, Quinn," Thomas snapped. "Rose is my fiancée." "No, I am not," Rose said, her voice ringing clear. "You made sure of that when you left me standing at the altar?" "I made a terrible mistake," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "Sarah, she means nothing to me. It was a moment of madness. Please, Rose, give me another chance." Rose looked at the man she had planned to marry and felt nothing but a distant pity. "You did not make a mistake, Thomas. You made a choice. You chose to humiliate me in front of everyone we know. You chose your own cowardice over basic decency. I could never trust you again, and without trust, there is nothing." "But I love you," Thomas protested weakly. "No, you do not," Rose said with certainty. "If you loved me, you would have talked to me when Sarah came back to town. You would have been honest instead of leaving me a note with the Reverend. You would have cared about my feelings even a fraction as much as you cared about your own confusion." Thomas opened his mouth to argue, but Yates cut him off. "You heard the lady. Time for you to go." Thomas looked between them, something ugly crossing his face. "I see what this is really about. You wasted no time finding a replacement, did you? And with a cowboy who smells like cattle, no less?" "Better to smell like honest work than cowardice," Yates said evenly, but Rose could feel the tension radiating from him. "We are leaving now," Rose said, turning away from Thomas. She climbed up onto the wagon seat, and Yates followed, taking up the reins. As they pulled away, Rose did not look back. She felt lighter somehow, as if confronting Thomas had lifted a weight she had not known she was carrying. "You all right?" Yates asked after they had left town behind. "Yeah," Rose said, surprised to find it was true. "I really am." Seeing him again, hearing him try to explain, it just confirmed what I already knew deep down. He would have made me miserable. "His loss," Yates said quietly. "What?" He glanced at her, and the intensity in his honey-colored eyes made her breath catch. "His loss is someone else's gain, maybe even someone's forever." Rose's heart pounded as she absorbed his words, the implication hanging between them like something fragile and precious. She wanted to ask him to explain, to tell her if he meant what she hoped he meant, but she was not ready yet. The hurt from Thomas was too fresh, and she needed time to understand her own feelings, but as they rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, Rose allowed herself to hope. Maybe this new life could offer more than just survival. Maybe it could offer happiness, too. The weeks that followed were some of the best of Rose's life. She fell into the rhythm of ranch work with surprising ease, finding satisfaction in tasks she would have once considered beneath her. There was something deeply fulfilling about baking bread and knowing the men would enjoy it, about keeping the house clean and organized, about seeing the tangible results of her labor. But more than the work, it was the company that made her happy. Pete taught her to rope, and she discovered she had a natural talent for it. Jack and Sam included her in their good-natured teasing, making her laugh until her sides ached. And Yates, always Yates, was a constant presence that made her feel safe and valued in a way she never had before. They spent the evenings together after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and Rose found herself looking forward to that quiet time more than anything else. They would sit on the porch as the desert cooled, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast sky. Yates would tell her about his plans for the ranch, his dreams of expanding the herd, and maybe buying adjacent land if it ever came up for sale. Rose would read passages from her growing collection of books shared from a trunk Yates had in his room full of novels and poetry. One evening in early October, as they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Yates turned to her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. "Rose, I need to tell you something," he began, then paused as if gathering his courage. "These past few weeks, having you here, it has been the best time of my life. And I know it has not been that long, and I know you have been through hell, but I cannot keep pretending what I feel for you is just friendship or employer concern." Rose's heart was thundering so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "Yates, let me finish," he said gently. "I am falling in love with you, Rose. Maybe I have been since the moment you walked into that saloon in your wedding dress, looking fierce and fragile all at once. I know the timing is terrible, and I will understand if you do not feel the same way, but I could not keep lying to you or myself." Rose felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "I thought I was going crazy," she whispered. "Feeling this way so soon after Thomas, I thought there was something wrong with me." "There is nothing wrong with you," Yates said fiercely. "What you felt for Thomas, that was not love. That was you trying to fit yourself into a mold because it was what you thought you should do. This, what we have, this is real." "How do you know?" Rose asked, needing to hear him say it. "Because when I look at you, I see who you really are, not who you think you should be. I see a woman who is brave enough to walk 3 miles in ruined slippers rather than face pity, who learned to cook for ranch hands and rope cattle and build a new life from scratch, who laughs at Sam's terrible jokes and has patience with Pete's long stories and does not back down when small-minded people try to shame her." He reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm around hers. "I see you, Rose Garrett, and I love everything I see." Rose was crying in earnest now, but she was also smiling. "I see you too," she said. "I see a man who is kind and strong, and who stopped everything to help a stranger in need, who works himself to exhaustion to build something meaningful, who makes me feel like I matter, like my thoughts and dreams and opinions are valuable." She squeezed his hand. "I am falling in love with you too, Yates Quinn, and it scares me and thrills me in equal measure." Yates let out a breath that sounded like relief and joy combined. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," Rose breathed. He stood and pulled her up gently, mindful of her feet, which had long since healed, but he still treated with care. His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears. Then he leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind, and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was soft and sweet, and nothing like the chaste pecks Thomas had given her during their engagement. This kiss was a promise and a question all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Rose felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. "I do not want to rush you," Yates said, resting his forehead against hers. "We can take this as slow as you need." "I do not want slow," Rose said, surprising herself with her boldness. "I have spent my whole life being careful and proper and doing what was expected. Where did that get me? Left at the altar by a coward, I want to live, Yates. I want to take chances. I want to be with you." "Are you sure?" he asked, pulling back to search her face. "People will talk. They already are. If we make this official, if we court properly, it will not be easy." "I do not care about easy," Rose said firmly. "I care about real. And this, you and me, is the most real thing I have ever felt." Yates smiled then, a true, full smile that transformed his face and made Rose's heart soar. "Then I guess I am the luckiest man in New Mexico territory." They stood on the porch holding each other as the stars emerged, and Rose felt truly at peace for the first time in her life. This was not the future she had planned, but it was infinitely better than anything she could have imagined. The next morning, Yates announced to the hands that he and Rose were courting. Pete just nodded knowingly, as if he had seen this coming from the start. Jack and Sam whooped and hollered, slapping Yates on the back and making Rose blush with their teasing. "About time, boss," Jack said with a grin. "We have been watching you two make eyes at each other for weeks now." "Have not," Yates protested, but his ears were red. "Have too," Sam chimed in. "It has been like watching a bad stage play where everyone knows the ending except the actors." Rose laughed and threw a dish towel at him, which he caught easily. The teasing continued through breakfast, and Rose felt warmth spread through her chest. This was family, she realized. Not the one she was born into, but the one she had chosen, and that had chosen her back. Word of their courtship spread through Hachita quickly, as Rose had known it would. Some people were scandalized, saying it was too soon and improper. Others were more understanding, recognizing that Rose had every right to find happiness after what Thomas had done. Rose tried not to care about the gossip, but it still stung when she overheard Mrs. Fletcher at the general store telling someone that Rose must have been carrying on with Yates before the wedding for things to move so fast. Yates noticed her distress when they returned to the ranch that afternoon. "What did she say?" he asked, his jaw tight. "It does not matter," Rose said, trying to smile. "It does to me," Yates insisted. "Rose, I will not have anyone speaking badly of you. Should I go back and set her straight?" "No," Rose said quickly, touching his arm. "That will only make it worse. Besides, let them talk. We know the truth, and that is what matters." But Yates was not satisfied with that. The next Sunday, he insisted they attend church together in town. Rose was nervous, knowing they would be the center of attention, but Yates was determined. "We have nothing to hide or be ashamed of," he said as they drove into Hachita, "and I will not have you thinking you need to skulk around because of what happened." The church fell silent when they entered together, Yates's hand warm and solid at the small of Rose's back. They walked down the aisle with their heads high and sat in a pew near the front. Rose could feel eyes boring into her back, could hear the whispers starting already. But then Yates reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers in plain view of everyone, and Rose felt her courage solidify. Reverend Matthews's sermon that day was about forgiveness and new beginnings, and Rose wondered if he had chosen it specifically for her benefit. When the service ended, several people approached them. Some were merely curious, but others were genuinely kind. Rose's mother was waiting outside, her face etched with worry. "Rose, sweetheart," she said, pulling her daughter into a fierce hug. "I have been so worried. Why did you not come home?" "I needed space, Mama," Rose said, hugging her back. "I needed to figure out who I was without everyone's expectations weighing on me." Her mother pulled back and studied her face, then glanced at Yates, who stood a respectful distance away. "And have you figured it out?" "I am getting there," Rose said with a small smile. Mama, I would like you to meet Yates Quinn. He gave me a job when I needed one, and has been nothing but kind and respectful. Her mother's sharp eyes assessed Yates, who met her gaze steadily. So you are courting my daughter? Yes, madam, Yates said, with all proper intentions, I assure you. She was supposed to be married by now, Rose's mother said, and Rose felt her heart sink. But then her mother continued, to a man who did not deserve her. Maybe this is how it was supposed to happen. Rose felt tears spring to her eyes. You are not disappointed in me. Disappointed? Her mother cupped Rose's face in her work-worn hands. I am proud of you. You could have crawled home and let that boy's cowardice define you. Instead, you built yourself a new life. That takes courage. The tears spilled over then, and Rose hugged her mother again, feeling a weight lift that she had not realized she was carrying. They talked for a while longer, and Rose promised to visit more often. Her father appeared and shook Yates's hand, his grip firm but approving. You treat her right, he said simply, or you will answer to me. Yes, sir, Yates agreed. I would not dream of doing otherwise. As they drove back to the ranch, Rose felt lighter than she had in months. Not everyone would approve of their relationship, but the people who mattered most were coming around. That was enough. The months that followed were a whirlwind of happiness mixed with hard work. Rose threw herself into improving the ranch house, using her wages to buy fabric for curtains and seeds for a garden. She planted vegetables and herbs near the house, delighting in watching them grow under the New Mexico sun. Yates built her a chicken coop, and soon they had fresh eggs every morning. As winter approached, the work on the ranch shifted. They brought the cattle closer to the buildings, prepared for possible storms, and stockpiled feed and supplies. Rose learned to knit from Pete, who had surprising skills with yarn and needles, and she made everyone warm socks and scarves for Christmas. On Christmas Eve, Yates gave her a present wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a leather-bound journal, much finer than the one Thomas had given her. For your real story, Yates said softly. The one you are living now. Rose's eyes filled with tears as she hugged him tight. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. For saving me that day, for giving me a job, for loving me. No, Yates said, tilting her chin up to look at him. Thank you for letting me. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Rose Garrett. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Rose felt desire curl hot in her stomach. They had been careful to maintain propriety, knowing that people were already gossiping. But it was getting harder to end their kisses, harder to say goodnight and retreat to separate rooms. Marry me, Yates said suddenly, pulling back to look at her with fierce intensity. I know it has only been a few months, and maybe you want to wait longer, but I do not. I want you to be my wife, Rose. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to build a life with you, have children with you, grow old with you. Marry me. Rose's heart felt like it might burst from her chest. Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you, Yates Quinn. His whoop of joy brought Pete and the brothers running from the bunkhouse thinking something was wrong. When they found out about the engagement instead, they insisted on celebrating. Pete produced a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion, and they all toasted to the happy couple's future. Later, when it was just the two of them again, Yates pulled a small box from his pocket. This was my grandmother's, he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a small sapphire. It is not much, but it is perfect, Rose interrupted, holding out her left hand. Yates slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit as if it had been made for her. They were married in February 1884 in a small ceremony at the ranch. Rose's family came, along with a handful of friends from town who supported them. Mrs. Chen prepared a feast, and even Dr. Patterson attended, joking that he should have known when he bandaged Rose's feet that day that this was how the story would end. Rose wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, pale yellow like sunshine, and carried wildflowers that Yates had ridden out to find that morning. As they stood before Reverend Matthews, exchanging vows on the porch of their home, Rose felt nothing but absolute certainty. This was right. This was real. This was love. When Yates kissed her as his wife, sealing their marriage, Rose heard the cowboys cheer and felt the warmth of the afternoon sun on her face. She thought briefly of that day in September when she had stumbled into a saloon in her wedding dress, heartbroken and humiliated. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone she barely recognized. Happy? Yates murmured against her lips. Happier than I knew was possible, Rose answered truthfully. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a discovery of each other that left Rose breathless and amazed. Yates was patient and careful, making sure she felt safe and cherished. When they finally lay tangled together in the darkness, Rose traced patterns on his chest and marveled at how her life had changed. "Do you ever think about how strange it is," she asked, "that the worst day of my life led to the best thing that ever happened to me?" "I think about it all the time," Yates admitted, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "And I thank God or fate or whatever force of the universe brought you to me that day. You are my miracle, Rose." "And you are mine," she whispered back. The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. A drought in late spring threatened the water supply, and they had to make tough decisions about the herd. Rose miscarried their first pregnancy in the summer, and they grieved together, holding each other through the pain. But they faced everything side by side, and their bond only grew stronger. In the fall, Rose discovered she was pregnant again. This time she was cautiously optimistic, taking extra care and letting Yates fuss over her even though she insisted she was fine. Pete and the brothers were endlessly solicitous, treating her like she was made of glass. Rose found it both annoying and touching. Their son was born in May 1885, during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and made the horses nervous in the barn. Doc Patterson delivered him with Mrs. Chen's assistance, and when Rose heard her baby's first cry, she wept with relief and joy. Yates held his son with shaking hands, his face full of wonder. "He is perfect," he said hoarsely. "Rose, we made something perfect." They named him William, after Yates's father, despite everything, because Yates wanted to reclaim that name and give it new meaning. William Quinn would grow up knowing he was loved and wanted, Yates swore. He would never doubt his father's devotion. Watching Yates with their son, Rose fell in love with him all over again. He was patient and gentle, changing diapers without complaint, and walking the floor with William during colicky nights. The tough cowboy who could rope and brand cattle melted into a puddle when his son gripped his finger with tiny hands. Pete carved William a toy horse, and Jack and Sam competed for the title of favorite uncle. The ranch hands were endlessly entertained by the baby, taking turns holding him and making ridiculous faces to earn his smiles. Rose realized that William would grow up surrounded by love, not just from his parents, but from this whole community they had built. When Thomas Pemberton rode out to the ranch one afternoon when William was 3 months old, Rose was shocked. She had not seen or heard from him since that confrontation in town over a year ago. Yates was out checking fences, and Rose was alone with the baby. "What do you want, Thomas?" she asked coolly, standing in the doorway with William on her hip. Thomas looked terrible, older than his years, with lines of dissatisfaction etched around his mouth. "I heard you had a baby," he said. "Congratulations." "Thank you," Rose said, not inviting him in. "Is that all?" "I wanted to say I am sorry," Thomas said, the words seeming to pain him. "For everything. You were right that day in town. I was a coward, and I hurt you badly. I have had a lot of time to think about it, and I need you to know that I regret it." Rose studied him dispassionately. Once his opinion had mattered so much to her. Now she felt nothing but mild pity. "I appreciate the apology," she said, "but it does not change anything. What you did led me to Yates, and I would not trade my life now for anything." "I can see that," Thomas said, glancing around at the ranch with something like envy. "You look happy, really happy, not the way you looked when you were with me." "I am," Rose confirmed. I hope you find that for yourself someday, Thomas. Real happiness, not just the appearance of it. He nodded and turned to leave, then paused. He is a lucky man, your husband. No, Rose said firmly. I am the lucky one. After Thomas rode away, Rose held William close and whispered to him about how life could surprise you in the best ways, how the worst moments could lead to unexpected joy, how love, real love, was worth waiting for. When Yates came home and she told him about Thomas's visit, he pulled her into his arms and held her tight. His loss was my forever, he said softly. Best trade I ever made. Rose laughed and kissed him, their son squirming between them. Mine too, she agreed. The years that followed were full and rich. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Grace, born in 1887, and another son named Henry, born in 1890. The ranch prospered under Yates's careful management, and they were able to buy the adjacent property when it came up for sale, expanding their operations significantly. Rose became known in the area as someone who would help anyone in need, never forgetting the kindness shown to her when she was at her lowest. She took in a young widow with 2 children for 6 months while the woman got back on her feet. She taught reading to ranch hands who had never learned. She organized a lending library in Hachita, donating many of her own books to get it started. Pete grew older and eventually retired from active ranch work, but he refused to leave. This is my home, he insisted, and Yates built him a small cabin where he lived comfortably, still carving toys for the children and offering advice when asked. Jack married a girl from town and built a house on the far edge of the property, becoming Yates's partner in the ranch rather than just a hand. Sam eventually moved to Arizona to start his own operation, though he visited often and remained close to the family. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1894, Yates surprised Rose with a trip to California. They left the children with Rose's parents and took the train west, watching the landscape change from desert to mountains to finally the coast. When Rose saw the Pacific Ocean for the first time, she cried. It was everything the books had promised and more, stretching endlessly toward the horizon, changing colors with the light, sounding like the world breathing. Was it worth the wait? Yates asked, his arm around her waist as they stood on the beach. Everything with you has been worth it, Rose said, turning to kiss him. Every moment. They spent a week in San Francisco exploring the city and enjoying the novelty of being somewhere new. But as much as Rose enjoyed the ocean, she found herself missing the desert, missing their ranch, missing their children. Home called to her in a way it never had before. When they returned to New Mexico, William, now 9 years old, ran to meet them, followed by Grace and little Henry. Rose scooped them up in her arms, breathing in the smell of sunshine and dust and home. This was her life. These people were her family, and she could not imagine anything better. That evening, after the children were in bed, Rose and Yates sat on the porch as they had so many times before. The stars were brilliant overhead, the desert air cool and clear. Do you ever regret it? Yates asked suddenly. How things turned out. You could have been a banker's wife in town with a fancy house and society parties. Rose turned to look at him, taking in the face she loved more than any other. Not for one single second, she said fiercely. You saved me, Yates. Not just that day in the saloon, but every day since. You showed me what real love looks like, what real partnership means. You gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams. You saved me too, Yates said softly. I was just existing before you, going through the motions. You brought color and joy and meaning to everything. You made my house a home. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands and watching the night sky. Rose thought about that girl who had walked into a saloon in a ruined wedding dress over 10 years ago. She would have been terrified to know what lay ahead, the hard work and heartache and uncertainty, but she also would have been amazed by the joy, the love, the family that would grow from that moment of devastation. His loss is my forever, Rose said quietly, echoing Yates's words from that day in town when they had confronted Thomas. Yates turned to her with a smile. And my forever is you. He kissed her as the stars wheeled overhead and the desert wind whispered through the scrub brush. It was not the ending Rose had once imagined for herself, but it was infinitely better. It was real and hard-won and precious. It was home. The children grew up strong and happy, learning to ride and rope and work the land. William eventually took over the ranch operations while Grace married a doctor and moved to Denver, and Henry became a lawyer who fought for water rights for small ranchers throughout the territory. Rose and Yates grew old together, their faces weathering like the landscape they loved, but their hands still finding each other across the dinner table, their eyes still lighting up when the other entered a room. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1924, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren, someone asked Rose to tell the story of how she and Yates met. She looked at her husband across the crowded porch, his hair now white but his eyes still that same honey gold, and she smiled. "I was left at the altar in my wedding dress," she began, and the younger grandchildren gasped dramatically. "I walked into a saloon not knowing what would happen next, and a cowboy stood up to help me. He said something that day that I did not understand until later." "What did he say, grandmother?" one of the children asked. Rose looked at Yates, and they shared a smile full of decades of love and understanding. He said, "His loss is my forever." And he was right. The man who left me standing at that altar lost the chance at a lifetime of love, and I gained everything I ever needed. That is how our story began, with an ending that was really a beginning. Yates raised his glass in a toast. "To beginnings," he said. "To forevers," Rose added. Everyone drank, and the celebration continued into the night, but Rose and Yates eventually slipped away to their favorite spot, the porch where they had spent so many evenings over the years. They sat close together, watching the stars and listening to the sounds of their family celebrating inside. "No regrets?" Yates asked, the question he had asked many times over the years. "Not a single one," Rose answered as she always did. "You are my greatest adventure, Yates Quinn." "And you are my forever, Rose Quinn," he replied. They sat together in the darkness, two hearts that had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and had built a life more beautiful than any fairy tale. The cowboy and the abandoned bride, now old and gray but still deeply, madly in love. Their story had begun with heartbreak and humiliation, but it had transformed into something magnificent, a love that had weathered decades and would endure as long as either of them drew breath. And when Rose finally closed her eyes for the last time many years later, Yates holding her hand just as he had promised all those years ago, her last thought was of gratitude. Gratitude for the man who had left her at the altar, because without that pain, she never would have found this joy. Gratitude for the cowboy who had stood up in a saloon and offered his hand to a stranger, and most of all, gratitude for the life they had built together, brick by brick, day by day, moment by precious moment. Their children buried them side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, where they could watch the sun rise and set over the land they had loved. And if you listen carefully on quiet desert evenings, some say you can still hear the echo of their laughter, the whisper of their promises, the eternal song of a love that transcended time and circumstance to become something truly forever.